evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ben Howe from Marketing Gloucester. I'd like to welcome you all to Wheatstone Hall at Gloucester City Museum. As part of the Gloucester History Festival, I was asked way back in January who I wanted to be the subject of one of our talks at the History Festival itself. And straight away I said Aethelflaed. She's one of the most inspirational women we've got in our history. I just don't think she's celebrated enough at all. So there's a number of people in this room actually, as well as in the city, that we're going to try and make her more well known across the country, not just in Gloucester as well. I'd like to hand you over now to Councillor Chris Chatterton, who's going to be taking this talk. So, everyone.
Thank you very much, and it's fantastic to see so many people here. We've had to nick some chairs out of the cafe because too many people. And actually, this is the second venue because we were originally going to be in a very small room up in the Guild Hall, but obviously the interest in Saxon Gloucester is such that we're overflowing in this space. So maybe next time we need to do it in a much bigger venue.
Yeah.
Firstly, I'd just like to say this is not a deep academic talk by any stretch of the imagination. This is aimed to be, I was asked if I could do something, is an introduction to somebody about whom very few people know anything at all. So that's going to be the nature of the talk that I'm going to do this evening. I got stitched up, I think, by Jason, the Chief Executive of Marketing Gloucester, who seemed to have developed a rather unhealthy crush on Aethelflaed. To the extent, and I'm not kidding, that if you walk into the offices of Marketing Gloucester, whereas some people have posters of film stars or of models on the wall, Marketing Gloucester have posters of Aethelflaed. So there's an unhealthy obsession developing, but this is a good thing because one of the main themes that I got out in my year as mayor, which ended in June of this year, was that Gloucester has an astonishingly interesting and rich and varied history, and we don't do a good enough job of telling it to people. And this is one small aspect of thousands of years of history, going back to the Neolithic settlements and the pottery that was found here, right up to events that are happening at the moment with the recent archaeological digs that took place in King's Square, with the finding of the cemetery literally over the road when they started construction on the houses last year. This is something that we need to tell more about, and I think the purpose of tonight is to introduce people who may not have heard of this particular individual to what life was like in the 9th and 10th century, what impact she had here in Gloucester, and more importantly the impact that she had in England as a whole. Because I don't know if anybody noticed, Michael Wood, the historian, has recently had, or repeated, a series on television on the Anglo-Saxons, Alfred, Aethelflaed and Aethelstan. And he argues quite convincingly in the programmes that this is the most important family that's ever lived in this country. He says the impact that they had on the development of England as a nation is unsurpassed by anybody either before or since. And I would argue, and I know Ben and Jason and all of the strange people of Marketing Gloucester would certainly agree, that the most important from our point of view is Aethelflaed. So we're going to have a look at her life. But before we get into the period that she was here in Gloucester, I think there's a chair just here and there's one just in the middle. We need to think about what Gloucester was like around the end of the 9th and the early 10th century. As everybody in this room will know, Gloucester was founded in the mid-1st century by the Romans, who built, first of all, a fort over in Kingsholm, about a mile away from here, and then 20 years later they built a fortress and then a colonia here in what is now the city centre. And in fact, part of the Roman wall runs quite literally underneath our feet where we are today. They lived here and it thrived and was an incredibly important centre for centuries until the Romans left in the 5th century AD. And after that, Gloucester, in common with other Roman cities, fell into serious decline. And archaeological evidence seems to indicate that after the departure of the Romans, Gloucester became effectively farms within the walls. There's very little ironworks and metalworks and industrial archaeology that survives from this period that shows anything happened here other than the buildings fell into ruin. People farmed and had more agricultural life here within Gloucester. And that was pretty much the way things stayed for a number of years, and Gloucester effectively disappeared off the historical map. There's a brief mention of the city in 577 AD, where after the Battle of Durham, Gloucester was one of the three cities that was the prize that was won during the battle. But not a lot happened until the Saxons arrived here in the 7th century. And this is where we need to look at how the city was developing in this period. The Saxons set up a series of 15 cities in this part of the country, and it formed part of a greater kingdom known as Mercia. It's divided into sub-kingdoms. Here in Gloucester we were part of the Wiki. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled in a very strange way. And they civilised to a certain extent. They built some buildings out of stone. They founded what's now the cathedral as an abbey in the 7th century. But Gloucester was not the centre of power that it had once been. All of that would change with the arrival of the family of Alfred and his children. And if you have a look at them. This is taken from a manuscript that shows the family lines. The gentleman in the middle is Alfred. I'm sure everybody is aware of Alfred. He's the only ruler of this country ever to be given the honorific the Great. And he was never meant to be king. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, but through a set of circumstances, he ascended to the throne in 871 AD. And he came to the throne at a very, very difficult time. Over the preceding 90 years or so, various armies from Denmark, Viking armies, had scavenging raids into England, mainly Northumbria and along the east coast. But in 865, the Great Army had arrived, the Great Heathen Army they called it, arrived and set about actually conquering and settling within England. And they started on the east coast, and they worked their way, as you can see on here, they worked their way slowly across the various areas of what we now know as England. They conquered East Anglia, they conquered all of the area around York, and they came through this is downside to smartboard, so I forgot any reason. They came through the centre of England, they came through Mercia, of which Gloucester formed a small part, and eventually they came down into Alfred's area, which was Wessex. And the army that was led by Guthrum launched an attack on Wessex at Chippenham and defeated the Saxon army. And they forced Alfred and his family to retreat into the Somerset marshes. And in fact, he was incredibly lucky to survive. But whilst in the marshes, Alfred set about partly a guerrilla campaign, but more about reorganising his forces. And he attacked out of the marshes, and he won a battle at Eddington in, well, I've got the year now, 876 and 877. He built up his army, and then at Eddington in May 878, he launched a surprise attack and defeated Guthrum's army. And this was the turning point in Saxon England. If this victory hadn't happened, in all likelihood, we wouldn't have been Anglo-Saxon, we would have been Anglo-Scandinavian. But as part of the process following his victory, he negotiated a treaty with Guthrum, who converted to Christianity. He was baptised, and they divided Mercia. Now, Alfred gained West Mercia as part of this process, and Eastern Mercia was operating as a separate kingdom. And the Lord, and this is where we get to the lake of our story, the Lord of Eastern Mercia was a gentleman called Aethelflaed. The name is familiar in later years. He was never listed as a king, he was listed as a lord, he was an ealdorman, and he paid homage to Alfred, and they joined forces together. And as part of that process, Aethelred married the firstborn child of Alfred. Aethelflaed, down here in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, Aethelflaed was born, we think, somewhere around 869 AD. When we think of the world in which she was born at a time when the Vikings were rampaging over the world in which she was growing up, when her father was being defeated and forced back. And she would have sat and grown up and observed the process that he went through in order to rebuild his army, to come up with battle plans, to attack Guthrum, to defeat him, and then to go on to success and peace treaties. She married Aethelred, we think, and the records are somewhat difficult to establish, but we think at the age of 15 or 16, which sounds very young nowadays, but in those days would have been perfectly normal. In fact, Judith, who was another Saxon lady around this time, had been married twice by the age of 15. Her first husband had been killed, and she was widowed and married for the second time at the age of 15. Interestingly, the dowry that Alfred paid as part of the deal for Aethelflaed and Aethelred to get married, we think is the largest dowry of all time. It was the city of London, which Alfred had recently taken from the Vikings, and he handed over to Aethelred as a sign of their agreement when his daughter married him. So, quite a nice dowry. I would imagine what that's worth nowadays. So Alfred set about strengthening his hold on his part of the kingdom, which is down here at the bottom. And he did that by a process of building stronghold settlements called burhs, which were fortresses from which you could consolidate and project power around an area. And this is something that is incredibly important because the lessons that Aethelflaed had learned in her father's household is something she took and she brought to Mercia when she married Aethelred. And so we have England divided. We've got Wessex in the bottom half and its dependencies under the control of Alfred. You have Mercia, which is effectively a separate kingdom, which is under the control of Aethelflaed and Aethelred. And then you have the Danelaw, which is controlled by Guthrum and Danes. So it's a rather challenging time in which to live. Around this time, the historical record starts to get a bit more interesting because in 890 AD, Alfred orders the production of a document, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which records the history of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, incidentally, writes about events that happened many centuries before. There's a fantastic entry for Gloucester from 488 AD, but obviously these were people writing with benefit of hindsight. But from 890 onwards, they were contemporary documents. They were written by people who were living through the events that they described. And so therefore you would think that they are an incredibly useful historical resource. Fortunately, as is common with everything, it's not quite as simple as that, because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles were predominantly written by people in Wessex, so they were putting across the Wessex point of view. But luckily, a document survived called the Mercian Register, which forms part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which gives the point of view of events from the Aethelflaed and Mercian perspective. So this is where we get a lot of our information. There is some conflict between the two, so it becomes difficult to establish. There's conflict on dates and on events and names and things like that. But we get a much better idea from 890 onwards on what the sequence of events were. And in 892, this starts to come to fruition, because in 892, an enormous Viking army arrived in force. Guthrum broke the terms of his treaty that he'd signed after his defeat at the Battle of Edington, and they attacked into Wessex and into Mercia. And what they found is, instead of walking over everything and destroying all of these places that they had done just a decade or so earlier, they found a network of garrisoned fortresses of burhs that had been constructed by Alfred over the preceding few years. And they found it very, very difficult to break through. A 4-year struggle went on between Alfred and the Vikings, and all of his power was cemented around the fortresses that he had built. And this was a very real and visible lesson that Aethelflaed and Aethelred learned, that formed part of their strategy in the decades to come. Around this time, in the mid-890s, Edward's son, Alfred's son Edward, who was Aethelflaed's younger brother, had a son called Aethelstan. He figures much more prominently later in the story. But in 895, as a young boy, he was sent to live with Aethelflaed. She actually fostered him and became a ward of hers. And so Aethelstan, the son of Edward, is now living with his aunt up in Mercia. And the way that the families live together is incredibly important in the early years of the 10th century as we'll discover very quickly. Move back to that. In 899, Alfred the Great died and was succeeded in Wessex by his son Edward, who we all know as Edward the Elder. And so what you have now is in the non-Viking part of England, Mercia and Wessex, so you have them ruled by a brother and his sister and her husband. So what we have is a very close family unit that are effectively in power, and how that manifests itself is incredibly interesting. Around this time, the late 9th century, we think that Gloucester starts to figure in the story, because the Roman city that I described at the beginning, that was effectively just farms within decaying buildings, within fallen stone walls, is rebuilt, and it's redesigned and laid out in a much more accessible way. We know that it had to happen before 907, because the Mercian Register lists every reconstruction that took place, and Gloucester must already have happened by that point in time. So Aethelflaed and Aethelred have followed the technique of her father Alfred in building fortresses and burhs at strategic locations around the country to defend themselves from the Vikings. And around this time, Gloucester, Hereford, slightly later on in 902, Chester, all formed part of it. And what we see is a line going up the end of the Mercian territory. There's a nice picture. There's their picture of Aethelflaed. So if you need a poster, there's your poster go. And we can see where the burhs started to be built over the years. We have Gloucester, Worcester, Warwick, Bridgenorth, Shrewsbury, Stafford, Chester and Edinburgh. And they are, the idea is that these burhs would be situated so nobody was ever more than 20 miles away from a secure place. And it would make it very difficult for the Vikings coming from these areas here, the 5 boroughs, and the Danish kingdom to come into power. And the same was mirrored in the kingdom of Wessex below us. And so it was an interesting military strategy that was developing. And it was put to the test in Chester in 907. Everybody assumes the Vikings are this homogenous race that come from Scandinavia and ravage and destroy and rape and pillage and all this kind of thing. And there were different Viking races. There's the Vikings that are here were Danish Vikings. Simultaneously had Norwegian Vikings, Scandinavians, northern Scandinavians, that had settled in Ireland. And so you have them on two sides. And the Norwegian Vikings in Ireland had been driven out in the early years of the 900s by the Irish from Ireland, and they had come across over here to try and settle here. And Aethelflaed and Aethelred came up with an interesting tactic, an interesting strategic idea, where they allowed the settlers a piece of land just upon the Wirral, right at the corner of the Wirral, thinking that they would be a nice buffer between the Mercians and between any further raiding parties that came in. Unfortunately, Vikings clearly can't be trusted, because a couple of years later, they saw that Chester was a thriving, rich city, and they attacked it, and they tried to take control. So Aethelflaed's strategy of building these fortresses, these burhs, was put to the test. And there's a fantastic account in the Irish annals of how they defended it. They said that they started throwing stones on the heads of the Vikings from the walls, and it made no difference. They carried on attacking. So they threw beer. They covered them all in beer, and they threw beer over the walls, which I know some people in this room would think is a terrible waste. And then they got the beehives from within the city, and they dropped the beehives on the heads of the Viking warriors and allowed the bees to attack them. And it worked. It drove them off. And the Vikings went back to their settlement up in Meos, up here in the north of the Wirral, and never caused a problem again. So the strategy, the defensive strategy of burhs was clearly successful. It clearly allowed them to keep the Vikings out. Now, if we just pause briefly in the sequence of events with Vikings and look back here in Gloucester and what was happening, and Aethelflaed and Aethelred were, in common with most people at the time, certainly leaders at the time, were very pious and religious people. And so what they did is they founded a priory. We all know it now as St Oswald's Priory. It wasn't called that originally, it was originally St Peter's Priory, not to be confused with St Peter's Abbey, all of 100 yards up the road. But they built this priory, and where it was situated actually was right next to, I'm assuming people know that there was a third channel of the River Severn. It never used to be just two, there was a third channel that ran pretty close to the road where B&Q is, as you go down past King's School and Archdeacon Meadow. And so the priory that they built was situated right on the banks. It was actually the third religious building that was in Gloucester at the time. You had St Peter's Abbey founded in the 7th century, you had St Mary's Low Church, which was built on a Roman house, and had been around by that period of time. But she built St Oswald's Priory here, where the old Severn is. And this is what we think is the street plan that Aethelflaed and Aethelred laid out in Gloucester in the 10th century. So they took the original Roman walls and they took the four main streets that would have existed, but they built the side streets off it. This is actually the eastern side of Gloucester is an almost exact replica of the redevelopment that Alfred did at Winchester about 15-20 years earlier. So you can see the pattern in Saxon towns. So we have St Oswald's and St Mary's Load, we have St Peter's, which is now Gloucester Cathedral. You've got volume. I mean, these churches are slightly later Saxon churches, but you can see where they built an additional wall around the Roman fortress. And the other thing that they did is, up in Kingsholm, they built a royal palace, a place where they would come, where they would hold court, where they would live. They only built a very small number of royal palaces. They built quite a lot of other things, and they fortified a lot of towns. But royal palaces, residences were very few and far between. And the fact that they chose Gloucester shows how significant they thought this place was. The Mercian Council actually held a great council in Gloucester. The first one was in 896. And it retained its importance for years and years. During the reign of Edward the Confessor, 9 councils for all England in those days were held here in Gloucester. William the Conqueror was in the Royal Palace when he ordered Doomsday in the late 11th century. So the foundation of the house by Aethelflaed and Aethelred was something that was incredibly significant and stayed for centuries afterwards. But they built a priory and they built a royal palace. And what they then decided to do was they wanted to increase the status, to make it even more important. And the best way of doing that in the 10th century was with relics, was to bring something to there that was important. And they selected, when you look at the evidence, you have to think that this was a deliberate idea. This wasn't just fortuitous. They brought the bones of St Oswald, St Oswald's Priory. Now, St Oswald was a very interesting person. He was a king. He was a Northumbrian king. He died fighting the pagans. He was one of the early